Winter of 1887, Wyoming lay buried beneath a merciless blizzard. The wind howled through the mountain passes like the wailing of restless spirits. In the midst of that frozen wilderness, a tiny railway depot in Cheyenne stood as a fragile shelter. For those who had nowhere else to go, on a weathered wooden bench inside the station sat a young woman. Her body curled against the cold. Every breath she drew turned into a pale cloud that dissolved into the dim light. Her name was Clara Whitmore, though the few who once knew her had called her Clary. Clutched tightly in her lap was a worn leather satchel. Inside lay nothing of value, only a handful of coins, a faded photograph, a small medical kit she guarded as if it were her last claim to dignity. Once, back in Philadelphia, she had been a devoted nurse, a woman who had eased pain, delivered comfort, and held the hands of the dying. But one scandal, whispered and twisted into poison, had destroyed everything. A powerful physician had tried to take advantage of her. She resisted, fought back, and somehow the story turned against her. He kept his reputation. She lost her livelihood, her friends, and her place in the world. So she had fled westward, chasing a fragile hope of beginning again. Fate had not been kind. Her money was gone, had turned her away. Now she sat in a station where no train would come until morning, her body shivering violently in the kind of cold that could kill before dawn, just as her eyelids grew heavy. And her numb fingers slipped from the satchel, the sharp rhythm of hooves echoed through the storm. A tall figure emerged from the snow, moving with an authority that silenced the room. His name was Nathaniel Harrow, owner of a sprawling ranch in the north. He extended his gloved hand toward Clary, a stranger offering salvation in the dead of winter. What Clary could not know was that Nathaniel's appearance was no accident. Behind the warmth in his eyes lay a secret one that bound him to the very past she had fled. And when that truth came to light, Clary would face a choice more harrowing than the cold itself: to forgive and reclaim her freedom, or to cling to the bitterness that had already stolen so much from her life. Clara Whitmore had always been taught that survival required caution. But that night in the Cheyenne depot, desperation made her reckless. When the tall man in the snow-dusted coat reached out his hand, she hesitated only for a moment before grasping it. His grip was firm, warm even through the leather glove. And in that instant, something inside her, fragile flicker of hope, stirred against the freezing numbness. Nathaniel Harrow didn't speak much as he guided her out into the storm. His horse stood tethered nearby, steam rising from its nostrils. With practiced ease, he lifted Clara into the saddle before mounting behind her. She felt the weight of his presence, steady and commanding, as he urged the horse northward. The towns. Dim lantern lights vanished behind them, swallowed by the white curtain of snow. The journey seemed endless. The wind bit into Clara's face, but the man's heavy coat shielded her from the worst of it. She wanted to ask where he was taking her, why he had chosen to help a stranger, but exhaustion pulled her eyelids down. She drifted between waking and sleep until the horse finally slowed. When Clara opened her eyes, it stood before a large ranch house, its windows glowing faintly against the storm. Nathaniel helped her down, his movements careful, almost protective. Inside, he said, his voice deep, carrying both authority and a trace of wariness. The warmth of the hearth hit her as soon as she stepped through the door. A fire crackled in the stone fireplace, its light casting restless shadows across the wooden floor. Clara collapsed onto a chair, too weak to protest, when a housekeeper appeared with a blanket and a bowl of broth. She ate mechanically, her mind racing with questions. Why had this man, a rancher of obvious wealth, bothered with her? In her experience, powerful men offered kindness only when it served their hidden desires. Yet Nathaniel kept his distance, speaking little, his expression unreadable. Over the following days, Clara began to regain her strength. She learned that the ranch was called Harrow's End, a sprawling estate built from timber and perseverance. Nathaniel oversaw it with quiet precision, his men respecting him more like a general than an employer. Despite his commanding presence, there was a heaviness about him, as if some shadow lingered just beyond the edges of his composed demeanor. At night, Clara often found herself wandering the halls of the house, unable to sleep. Her thoughts circled back to Philadelphia, to the betrayal, the disgrace, the friends who had turned their backs. Bitterness gnawed at her, but in the silence of the ranch, she also felt the faint stirrings of something else. Safety, perhaps even belonging, and yet there were questions. One evening, while Nathaniel was away inspecting the stables, Clara drifted into the study. Papers lay scattered across the desk, maps of the surrounding land. And most curiously, a small leather notebook with initials etched into the cover. Her breath caught when she recognized the initials. They were the same as the physician who had ruined her life. Clara's fingers trembled as she set the notebook back down. The coincidence seemed impossible. She told herself it must belong to someone else, perhaps a business partner. But deep down, a cold unease crept into her chest. Nathaniel Harrow had saved her life in the blizzard. Yet now, with every passing hour, Clara began to wonder, had fate delivered her into the hands of a savior, or into the grip of someone tied to the very past she was trying so desperately to escape? The snow outside finally began to melt, but the chill in Clara's chest remained. Days at Harrow's End followed a quiet rhythm, meals taken in the long dining room, Nathaniel's men coming and going from the ranch yard, and the ceaseless wind sighing across the plains. To anyone else, it might have felt peaceful. To Clara, it was a fragile calm overlaying something darker. She kept thinking about the initials she had seen on that notebook in the study. ALM, they belonged to Dr. Alan L. Merrick, the man who had once been her mentor in Philadelphia, before he turned her into a scapegoat for his mistakes. Lies had destroyed her career, her reputation, and nearly her will to live. The idea that anything of his would be here hundreds of miles away was unbearable. Clara told herself it was just coincidence that she was letting ghosts twist her perception. But one evening, she caught Nathaniel looking at that very notebook, his thumb brushing over the worn leather cover. His face was unreadable, but the gesture was almost tender. "Where did you get that?" she asked before she could stop herself. Nathaniel glanced up, surprised. For a moment, his eyes, steel, gray, and sharp, held hers. Then he shut the book with deliberate care. "It belonged to a man I once knew," he said simply, offering nothing more. Something in his tone warned her not to press further. Yet curiosity clawed at her. Clara needed answers, even if the truth threatened to break whatever fragile trust was growing between them. Over the next week, she began to notice other details. A faded photograph tucked into a drawer, Merrick's unmistakable profile beside. A younger Nathaniel, a ledger listing medical supplies, though Nathaniel was no doctor. And late one night, when she wandered the halls again, she heard him pacing in his study, his voice low as if speaking to someone who wasn't there. Still, Nathaniel was never cruel. If anything, he seemed careful with her, as though he carried his own secret burden. He made sure she was fed, that she had warm clothes. When she ventured outside to help in the stables, he didn't stop her, though he watched from a distance, his expression unreadable. It was during one of those afternoons in the stables that Clara finally dared to confront him. The air smelled of hay and horses, dust motes swirling in the sunlight. Nathaniel was checking a mare's hooves when Clara stepped forward. "You knew him, didn't you?" she asked quietly. "Dr. Merrick, he wasn't just a passing acquaintance." Nathaniel's hands stilled. Slowly, he set down the hoof pick and straightened, his height casting a long shadow across her. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, with a sigh, he removed his gloves. "Yes," he admitted. His voice was low, heavy. "Alan Merrick was more than a colleague. He was my brother-in-law." The word struck Clara like a blow. Her breath caught in her throat, her heart hammering. Brother-in-law. That meant Nathaniel had been family to the man who had ruined her life. Her instincts screamed at her to run, to pack her things and vanish before this connection dragged her back into the nightmare she had fled. But her legs wouldn't move. Instead, she stood frozen, staring at Nathaniel as he continued. "He married my sister when they were both young," Nathaniel said, his gaze distant. "For a time, I thought he was an honorable man. He spoke of saving lives, of building trust. But over the years, I learned the truth." He shook his head slowly, as if reliving a bitter memory. "Alan Merrick was clever, yes, but he cared only for himself. My sister paid the price for trusting him." Clara's throat tightened. She wanted to demand why Nathaniel still kept Merrick's belongings, why he held on to reminders of a man so poisonous. But another question pressed harder against her heart. Did Nathaniel know her connection to Merrick? Did he know she was the nurse he had destroyed? That night, sleep would not come. Clara lay awake, torn between fear and an aching curiosity. Nathaniel Harrow was both protector and enigma, a man who had offered her shelter yet carried the shadow of the same betrayal that had nearly destroyed her. And deep inside, she began to fear a possibility that chilled her more than the snow ever had. That fate had not drawn her to Harrow's end. By chance at all, the following days stretched long and uneasy. Clara carried Nathaniel's revelation like a weight pressed against her ribs. Lon Merrick had been his brother-in-law. That name alone had been enough to unravel her past. Yet here it was, bound inextricably with the man who had given her shelter. She tried to avoid him at first, lingering in the barn, the kitchen, or by the frozen creek where she could breathe without his presence pressing down on her. But Nathaniel seemed to notice. He didn't confront her. Instead, he left. Quiet offerings, a book placed at her table, a mug of steaming tea waiting by the fire, a scarf folded neatly at the foot of her bed. These gestures unsettled her more than anger would have. One evening, Clara returned to her room and found a note on her bedside table, written in Nathaniel's careful hand. "You deserve to know everything. Meet me in the study when the lanterns are lit." Her fingers trembled as she held the slip of paper. The study where the notebook and photograph had been, where shadows seemed to gather thickest. Part of her wanted to tear the note into shreds, pretend she had never seen it. Yet she couldn't. She needed answers, even if the truth scorched her. When Clara entered the study that night, Nathaniel was already waiting. The firelight flickered across his face, casting his features in stark planes of light and shadow. On the desk lay the leather-bound notebook, open this time, its pages dense with cramped handwriting. This was Merrick's journal. Nathaniel began, his voice quiet but steady. "When my sister fell ill, he disappeared into his work, scribbling page after page. He claimed he was close to some breakthrough, that she had to be patient. But she wasn't patient, she was dying. And he did nothing." His hand clenched into a fist. "I buried her myself while he ran from his failures." Clara's breath caught. The story twisted painfully inside her, mirroring her own. She remembered the endless nights at the hospital in Philadelphia, the patients Merrick abandoned when mistakes piled too high, and the way he shifted blame onto her shoulders when everything collapsed. Nathaniel turned the journal toward her. "I kept this because it was the only piece of truth left. Proof of what he really was." Clara hesitated, staring at the pages. The looping scrawl was achingly familiar. With each line she read, memories surged back the way Merrick wrote notes. Not to record reality, but to control the narrative, bending it always in his favor. And there, halfway through the book, she saw her own name. Nurse Clara Whitmore Careless. Insubordinate, dangerous to patients. The words blurred as hot tears filled her eyes. She closed the journal with a snap, her chest heaving. "You don't understand," she whispered, her voice raw. "Those lies, they ruined me. He destroyed my life." Nathaniel's head jerked up, his eyes narrowing. "What did you say?" Tara forced herself to meet his gaze. the truth she had hidden since arriving at Harrow's. N spilled out, unstoppable. She told him about Philadelphia, about the hospital, about Merrick's accusations, and how she had been forced to leave in disgrace. Her voice cracked, but she pressed on, laying bare every scar the man had left on her. When she finished, silence filled the study. The fire popped in the grate, the only sound in the oppressive stillness. Nathaniel stared at her, unreadable dot. "So you were the nurse," he said at last, his tone rough. "The one he wrote about?" Clara's stomach twisted. She expected anger, maybe even contempt. Instead, Nathaniel leaned back in his chair, his expression torn between rage and grief. "I thought I hated him for what he did to my sister," Nathaniel murmured, almost to himself. "But now I see his cruelty went farther than I ever imagined." Clara wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly chilled. "You believe me?" Nathaniel's gaze snapped to hers, fierce and unflinching. "I know the kind of man he was. And if he blamed you, then you were never at fault." Merrick never carried blame that belonged to him. Relief broke over Clara like a wave, but it was tangled with fear. She had trusted him with the truth, yet now she wondered, what did this bond mean? Their lives, once separate, were now joined by the same scar, the same man who had stolen so much from both of them. Nathaniel rose, crossing the space between them. For the first time, Clara noticed how weary he looked, as though years of bitterness had carved deep lines into his face. He stopped just short of her, his voice low. "You and I, we carry the same ghost. But tell me, Clara," his eyes searched hers, storm gray and unyielding, "do you seek vengeance or forgiveness?" The question struck her deeper than any confession. She thought of all the nights she had cursed Merrick's name, all the hours she had replayed her downfall, longing for justice. And yet, standing here, staring at a man who bore the same pain, she wondered if vengeance would ever heal them more, only chain them to the past forever. Clara had no answer. Not yet. That night, long after Nathaniel had left her alone in the study, Clara sat with the journal on her lap. She stared at her name scrawled in Merrick's damning hand, then slowly turned the page. For the first time in years, she forced herself to read, not to relive the pain, but to understand. Somewhere in these pages lay the choice she would have to make, and Clara realized that the true test was no longer about surviving Merrick's betrayal. It was about deciding who she would become once the truth was finally hers. The following morning, the storm had broken, leaving the countryside draped in silence. Snow lay heavy across the grounds, muffling every sound, as if the world itself were holding its breath. Clara awoke with the journal still clutched in her, hands her eyes raw from reading deep into the night. The words inside had haunted her. Merrick's handwriting, sharp and unyielding, painted her as reckless, even dangerous. He described her as someone incapable of compassion, a nurse whose arrogance had endangered lives. Clara had spent years trying to forget those lies, yet here they were again, preserved in ink like poison pressed into the page. And yet, in between the accusations, she caught glimpses of another truth, of his obsession, of his paranoia, of a man unraveling under the weight of his own failures. She saw how Nathaniel's sister, Eleanor, had been reduced in his notes to nothing more than a case study, her humanity stripped away. Clara could not decide what unsettled her more, the venom Merrick had reserved for her, or the cold indifference he had shown toward his own dying wife. She found Nathaniel outside, chopping wood by the barn. His movements were sharp, almost violent, each swing of the axe cleaving through the frozen silence. When he saw her approach, he rested the axe against the stump, breathing hard, his breath curling white in the cold air. "You read it all," he said, not as a question, but a certainty. Clara nodded. "I did." Nathaniel wiped his brow with the back of his sleeve. "So you know the kind of man he was. A coward, a fraud." His jaw tightened. "But I still don't understand why you carry his ghost as heavily as I do." "You should hate him." "I did," Clara admitted softly. For years, I hated him. I wanted him ruined. I wanted him to feel what I felt when he branded me a danger to the very patients I swore to heal. But the longer I carried that hate, the heavier it became, till it was all I had left. Nathaniel studied her, his eyes searching. And now, Clara hesitated, the words trembling on her tongue. Now I'm afraid that if I keep feeding that hate, I'll never be able to let go. I'll never be free of him. For a long moment, Nathaniel said nothing. His hands gripped the handle of the axe, knuckles white, as though he too were wrestling with something he could not put into words. At last he muttered, "Forgiveness doesn't change what he did." "No," Clara agreed. "But maybe it changes what's left of us." The words lingered in the frozen air between them. Later that evening, Clara returned to the study. She had decided to confront the pages again, not as a victim this time, but as a witness. She copied passages onto scraps of paper, marking where Merrick twisted facts, where his lies tangled with fragments of truth. She wanted to unravel his narrative thread by thread, till it lost its power over her. When Nathaniel joined her, he stood silently at her side, watching as she spread the scraps across the desk like pieces of a puzzle. "You're dissecting him," he remarked. "I'm taking back what he stole," Clara replied firmly. "My name, my story." Nathaniel's gaze softened, though his expression remained clouded. "You think forgiveness lies at the end of that?" "I don't know," she admitted, "but I know I can't carry both hatred and healing. One will smother the other." The fire cracked, scattering sparks across the hearth. Nathaniel sank into the chair opposite her, his features worn with exhaustion. "My sister used to say something similar," he confessed, voice low. "That forgiveness was the only medicine for a wound that wouldn't close. I thought she was naive. I told her some wounds don't deserve to heal." His eyes lifted to Clara's, shadowed but glimmering with something fragile. "But maybe I was the one who couldn't see straight." Clara's chest tightened at his admission. In that moment, she realized how much bitterness had carved its way into both of their lives. Two strangers, connected by a man's cruelty, now sat in the same dim room, wondering if they could unshackle themselves from the chains he had left behind. Nathaniel reached across the desk, his rough hand brushing against one of the scraps of paper. "Tell me, Clara, if we find forgiveness, who will we be then?" Clara looked at him, her throat thick with unspoken words. She didn't have the answer, not yet. But for the first time, she felt that the question itself was worth carrying, because it meant there was still a chance for something beyond the shadows Merrick had cast. The snowstorm passed, leaving the world eerily calm. Clara awoke before dawn, her body tense with a strange anticipation. The journal still rested on the desk, its pages like a wound refusing to close. She had marked sections in red ink Merrick's accusations, his twisted reasoning, the venom he left behind. But there were also entries Nathaniel hadn't read. Passages so dark Clara had hesitated to share them. One in particular struck her. "Eleanor's decline will serve me. Her weakness, her fading mind, these will be proof of my theories. Even in death, she will not betray my work." Clara felt her stomach turn. Merrick had not only destroyed her career, he'd exploited Nathaniel's sister as nothing more than a subject in his obsession. When Nathaniel entered the room, she silently handed him the page. His eyes scanned it, his jaw tightening with each line. Then, with a sudden motion, he tore the sheet from the journal and threw it into the fire. Flames devoured the paper instantly, but the fury in his eyes burned hotter still. He used her. Nathaniel spat. "My sister was dying, and he turned her into an experiment. I should have killed him when I had the chance." Clara flinched at the venom in his voice. "Nathaniel." He slammed his fist against the desk, the sound echoing through the silent house. "You talk of forgiveness, Clara, but tell me, how do you forgive this? How do you forgive a man who stripped your name, who exploited my sister, who left nothing but rot behind?" Clara's heart pounded. She saw the raw torment in him, the years of grief corroding into rage. And for the first time, she feared he might destroy himself, trying to destroy the ghost of a man already gone. Hatred is what he wanted. She whispered, forcing her voice steady. Don't you see? Merrick fed on it. He thrived, knowing we carried his cruelty long after he was gone. If we let this rage consume us, then he still wins. Nathaniel's breathing was ragged, his shoulders shaking. He stared into the flames as though searching for an answer inside them. Clara reached across the desk and laid her hand gently on his. We can choose to end this. Not for him, for us, for Eleanor. Let her memory be love, not vengeance. For a long moment, Nathaniel didn't move. Then his hand closed over hers, trembling but firm. His eyes glistened with unshed tears, and for the first time, Clara saw not just anger in them, but a deep, aching grief. That night, they carried the journal into the woods behind the manor. The air was bitter cold, the moonlight casting silver over the snow. Nathaniel built a small fire, his hands steady now, almost reverent. Clara handed him the journal, its leather cover cracked with age. Are you ready? She asked softly. He looked at her, then at the book, the last remnant of Merrick's hold over their lives. With a solemn nod, he placed it into the fire. Flames licked greedily at the pages, curling them into ash. The smell of burning paper filled the air, mingled with the faint crackle of embers. For a long while, neither of them spoke. They only watched as the fire consumed Merrick's words, the lies, the venom, the pain. It was as though the forest itself bore witness to the unburdening of two fractured souls. At last, Nathaniel whispered, his voice breaking, Eleanor deserved better. You deserved better. I can't change what was stolen, but maybe I can stop carrying it. Clara felt tears sting her eyes. She took his hand again, holding it tightly as the fire died down to glowing embers. Let this be the end, she said. It's not of memory, but of the chains he left us. Nathaniel nodded, his shoulders easing for the first time. In the silence of the winter woods, something fragile but unmistakable stirred between them, not the absence of pain, but the beginning of peace. As they turned back toward the manor, Clara knew forgiveness would not come easily. It would not be sudden nor perfect, but it would be a choice, one they could make again and again, until the past lost its power, and in that choice there was freedom. The following days passed in a silence that felt different from before. It was no longer the suffocating quiet of resentment, nor the hollow emptiness Merrick's shadow had imposed on them. Instead, it was a silence of healing, tentative, but real, like soil slowly thawing after a long winter. Clara spent mornings walking through the manor's frost-covered gardens, her breath rising in soft clouds. The flowers lay dormant, but she could see the buds beneath the snow waiting. She thought of herself the same way, buried under layers of accusation and shame, yet perhaps still capable of blooming once the weight was lifted. Nathaniel too seemed changed. His anger no longer exploded in sudden bursts, though it lingered in his eyes, a scar he carried. But there was something gentler in him now. He began repairing broken shutters, mending the fence at the edge of the property, even stacking wood for the hearth. Ordinary tasks, perhaps, but each one an act of reclaiming. Yet forgiveness was not simple. One evening, Clara found herself staring at the charred remains of the journal in the fire pit. The ashes had scattered, carried by the wind, but a part of her still wondered, was it truly gone? Could fire erase the words that had once shaped her fate? Nathaniel approached, carrying 2 mugs of tea. He noticed her gaze on the ashes. You regret it? He asked quietly. She hesitated, then shook her head. No, but forgiveness isn't as easy as burning a book. His voice still lingers. Sometimes I hear it when I write, whispering that no one will believe me. Nathaniel sat beside her, the firelight softening his features. I hear him too, he admitted. Every time I think of Eleanor, I hear Merrick saying she was nothing more than a study. I thought destroying his words would silence him. But maybe it isn't about silence. Maybe it's about learning to live despite the noise. Clara studied him, surprised by the clarity in his tone. It struck her that forgiveness wasn't an instant release, was a practice. A decision renewed daily, like tending a fragile flame. Later that night, she returned to her study. For the first time in years, she opened a fresh notebook. Pages gleamed white and untouched, free from Merrick's corruption. She dipped her pen and wrote, "My name is Clara Whitmore, and this is my truth." The words came haltingly at first, but soon they flowed. She wrote not to prove anything to the world, nor to clear her reputation, but to reclaim her voice. She described the night she lost her research, the day Merrick stood before the tribunal, the weight of exile she carried, and the moment she nearly gave in to despair. But she also wrote of the fire in the woods, of the choice she and Nathaniel made to end Merrick's hold over them. When she set down her pen, tears blurred the ink. Yet they were not tears of defeat, they were release. In the days that followed, Nathaniel often joined her at the desk. He began sketching Eleanor's face from memory, his pencil strokes tender, reverent. Sometimes he would pause, his hand trembling, but Clara would place her hand over his, steadying it. Together, they created a record not of Merrick's lies, but of Eleanor's life as she truly was. Warm, curious, stubbornly alive even in illness. One morning, the sunlight finally broke through the winter haze. Nathaniel turned to Clara with a quiet conviction. "I don't know if I can ever fully forgive him. But maybe that's not the point. Maybe it's enough to choose not to let him shape the rest of our lives." Clara smiled faintly. Forgiveness isn't about absolution, it's about freedom. We give ourselves back to ourselves. For the first time, Nathaniel returned her smile, not strained, not bitter, but genuine. The manor no longer felt haunted. The creaks of its floorboards, the whispers of the wind through its halls, even the shadows in the corners all seemed less oppressive. It was as though the house itself had exhaled, and so had they. Spring arrived slowly, almost shyly, as if testing whether the land and its people were ready for renewal. Snow melted into rivulets that ran down the hillsides, and the once stiff branches of the apple trees swelled with promise. For Clara and Nathaniel, the thawing earth mirrored the thaw within themselves. One afternoon, Clara suggested they leave the manor for a walk into town. Nathaniel hesitated at first. The townspeople had once whispered about them, about Merrick's trial, about Eleanor's tragedy. But Clara's insistence was gentle yet firm. "We can't keep living behind locked doors," she said. "Not anymore, so." They went walking side by side down the winding road into the village. Heads turned as they entered the square, but the reaction wasn't what Nathaniel had expected. There were no glares, no accusatory murmurs. Instead, people nodded politely, some even offering small smiles. Time, it seemed, had worn down the sharper edges of gossip. At the market, Clara bought fresh bread and apples. The vendor, an elderly woman, handed her the bag with a kind look. "It's good to see you again, Mrs. Whitmore," she said softly. Clara nearly wept at the normalcy of it. Later, back at the manor, Nathaniel confessed that the walk had unsettled him not because of the villagers, but because of how much lighter he felt afterward. "For years, I thought Merrick's words defined me," he admitted. "But perhaps they only had power because I let them." Clara touched his hand. "We both did. But we don't have to anymore." That night, they sat by the fire reading through Clara's new manuscript. It wasn't a book of theories or defenses. It was a story honest, vulnerable, deeply human. She had written about betrayal and grief, but also about resilience and the strange, imperfect road to forgiveness. Nathaniel read it silently for a long time, then set it down with tears in his eyes. "You've written Eleanor back into the world," he whispered. Clara smiled through her own tears. "And you've drawn her there too." They spoke late into the night, not of Merrick, but of Eleanor, her laughter, her stubbornness, the way she once pressed wildflowers between the pages of books. By dawn, they felt as though they had resurrected her memory, not as a victim of manipulation, but as the vibrant soul she had been. Weeks passed, and life took on a rhythm again. The garden flourished under Clara's care, while Nathaniel restored the old greenhouse, turning it into a sanctuary of light. Slowly, the manor shifted from a place of shadows to one of growth. One morning, Nathaniel found Clara in the greenhouse, her notebook open, sunlight spilling across the page. She looked up at him with a softness he hadn't seen in years. "Do you think?" she asked quietly. "That forgiveness means forgetting?" Nathaniel thought for a long moment. "No," he said finally. "I think it means remembering without letting it poison us. We don't forgive for them. We forgive for ourselves." Clara nodded, closing her notebook. "Then I think we're learning." In the months that followed, Clara sent her manuscript to a small publisher. To her surprise, they accepted it. When the book arrived, bound and real, she placed a copy on the mantel. The title read, "Ashes and Echoes," a story of truth and forgiveness. Nathaniel held it in his hands for a long time, then placed Eleanor's sketch beside it. Two testaments, side by side, not of Merrick's power, but of their own. That evening, as dusk painted the sky, Nathaniel lit a lantern and carried it out into the garden. Clara followed, curious. He set the lantern at the base of the old apple tree and stepped back. "What's this?" she asked, smiling. "A marker," he said softly. "Not for Merrick, not for what we lost, but for what we've chosen. To remember and to forgive and to live." Clara slipped her hand into his, and together they stood beneath the blossoming branches. For the first time, the silence around them was not heavy, but holy. The past would always remain a part of them, but it no longer defined them. And as the lantern flickered against the twilight, Clara knew with quiet certainty they had found freedom not by erasing the pain, but by forgiving it. And in that forgiveness, they were finally home. If this story touched something deep within you, if you found yourself reflecting on the mysteries of memory, the weight of betrayal, and the quiet courage it takes to forgive, then you're exactly where you're meant to be. Here on Real Moments, we don't just share stories. We share journeys, complex, emotional, sometimes painful, but always profoundly human. Each tale is a reminder that life isn't simply about the struggles we endure, but about what we choose to do with them. Do we let them define us? Or do we, like Clara and Nathaniel, learn to rise from the ashes and walk a new path, one built not on bitterness, but on healing? When you subscribe to this channel, you become part of a community that believes in the power of storytelling to transform hearts. We believe in stories that ask hard questions. Can we truly forgive someone who has broken us? Is healing possible after betrayal? What does it mean to carry the past without letting it consume the future? By staying with us, you'll discover more narratives, some mysterious, some heartbreaking, some deeply uplifting, that remind us all of one universal truth. No matter how dark life becomes, there is always a way forward. So, if you haven't already, take a moment to subscribe to Real Moments. Hit the bell icon so you'll never miss a story that might just shift the way you see your own life. And if this story resonated with you, if you've ever wrestled with the ghosts of the past or found strength in forgiveness, share your thoughts in the comments. Your words might be the light someone else needs, because at the end of the day, Real Moments isn't just about stories, it's about connection. It's about remembering that even in our darkest chapters, we're never truly alone. Join us. Let's walk this journey together.